He arrived in London with a suitcase that smelled faintly of smoke, and a pair of running shoes wrapped in newspaper the way you'd wrap something you weren't sure you deserved. The train had rattled through a countryside still learning how to be green again, past fields where metal once bloomed and boys learned the names of towns by reading them on ration tins. At Euston, the platform shone with a thin film of coal dust and hope. The city rose around him in scaffolds and resolve, bricks piled like promises, windows patched with cardboard and grace. He stepped into the air and felt the strange weight of peace, lighter than war, heavier than guilt. He used to move differently. In uniform, you walk like a sentence drafted by someone else. Now he tried to remember how a man walks when the ground doesn't belong to the military. He found his name on a clipboard in a stranger's hand and followed a volunteer in a threadbare blazer to a bus with peeling paint. The driver had the tired dignity of a man who had driven through the Blitz and kept going. They passed a billboard announcing the Austerity Games in letters that remained cheerful despite the weather. No new arenas. No Olympic village made of marble and television. Just borrowed classrooms, barracks still smelling of soap and metal, and a stadium patched where it had cracked. It was enough. It had to be. He told himself he was here to run. That was the sentence he carried now, the one he chose. But it wasn't the whole truth. He was here to ask a question no one could hear but him. Could a man who had learned to move for death learn to move for life again? They took his measurements with a tailor's tape older than he was. They handed him a kit stitched by hands more accustomed to mending than to celebration. In the mirror he saw the ghost of the soldier he had been standing behind the runner he used to be. He practiced not looking away. At night the barracks were a hymn of quiet chores. Boots by bunks, shirts drying on cords pulled tight between windows, kettles clicking on borrowed hot plates. He lay awake listening to the breathing of men who had marched through deserts and forests, and then somehow found their way back to lanes painted on grass. He heard the deep inhalations of a discus thrower whose hands looked like he had wrestled down trucks. The restless turning of a miler whose feet never stopped practicing even in sleep. The soft murmured prayers of a hurdler who counted his forgivenesses instead of sheep. He went to the track at dawn when the light was a thin gray ribbon. The stadium felt like a cathedral rebuilt from notebooks and memory, its edges patched, its air honest. He stood on the cinder and stared down the straight as if it were a road that led home. His coach, once a sergeant, always a sergeant, watched with eyes that had learned to measure distance in more than meters. "You remember," the coach said, "the difference between running to reach and running to escape." "I used to," he said. "Good," the coach said. "We're going to remind your body." He began with drills so simple they embarrassed him. Knees to chest, ankles snapping like flint, arms in the geometry of intention. The first strides were an argument with himself. His legs had stored commands from other days: drop, press, sprint, stop, advance, retreat, find cover, hold fire. He ran with ghosts on either side of his lane and the stubbornness of a man who knows there is work to be done whether or not anyone claps. The city worked beside him. Londoners queued with cheerful grief at ration counters that still ran short. Milk bottles wore paper hats. Children kicked balls through gaps where houses had been. Shopkeepers opened with the pride of survivors, dusted shelves with the tenderness of undertakers. Everywhere there was evidence of the tightrope between scarcity and celebration. Flags that had been patched with pieces of aprons, bouquets made of fabric and ribbon, a piano on a flatbed that traveled from neighborhood to neighborhood, turning streets into dance floors. People smiled like they were trying something delicate for the first time in years. He learned the route from barracks to stadium by the sound of hammers and birds. He wrote letters he never sent. To a man whose helmet he had picked up in an orchard. To a boy whose name he didn't know but whose last laugh he remembered. To a girl who had said she'd wait and did, and then learned you can wait without standing still. He folded the letters into smaller shapes until they were merely the size of a breath, and then he tucked them into the pocket with his starting pins. He told himself that when the gun finally sounded, The sound would carry those words somewhere kinder. He did not talk about the night in the forest when the moon made the snow look like a sheet over a body, nor about the river crossing where he had counted heartbeats to keep from screaming, nor about the church where he had lit a candle for everyone but himself. He did not tell anyone that part of him had not expected to live long enough to be hungry for anything as ordinary as a race. He kept those truths folded too. He carried them the way a man carries flint in a pocket, not to start a fire, but to remember he could. There was a shooter on the team who polished his rifle the way a lover might brush hair from a face. The shooter had eyes like coin edges and hands you would trust with a heartbeat. They ate together sometimes in a mess hall that smelled of potatoes and stories. The shooter said, "My sport is a lie, do you know that? We pretend to control the moment of impact. We don't. We only learn to be honest with the moment before it." The runner understood that perfectly. His sport, too, was a conversation with a fraction of a second. He learned again how to live there, how to make a home of that country where the gun goes off and the world narrows to breath, motion, and the memory of the next step. When the opening ceremony finally arrived, the stadium filled with people who had borrowed their best clothes from closets that still smelled of damp and soap. Delegations entered not as armies but as confessions. Flags waved like bandages. The music was sturdy and kind. He walked with his teammates and felt taller than he had in years without feeling larger. When the flame was lit, a woman near him cried in a way that sounded like laughter remembered. For a moment he believed in the possibility that light could be more than a symbol. For a moment he believed it could be a promise. He did not sleep the night before his heat. He lay awake counting the rectangles of window light moving across the ceiling and listening to the stadium breathe. He made a bargain with himself. If he won, he would write one of the letters and actually send it. If he lost, he would still run the warm down as if it mattered. He promised to forgive his legs for being human. The morning came dressed as a sermon. The air held its own counsel, cool, serious, attentive. He laced his shoes with the care of a man tying a memory. On his way to the call room, he saw the disc thrower slowly wrapping tape around his fingers as if binding a spell. Saw the miler moving through invisible gates. Saw the hurdler kiss his hands and press them to each knee. He did not pray. He had learned, perhaps too well, that prayers and orders sound similar in the wrong rooms. He just breathed until the world balanced. On the line, he felt the old geometry return. Left foot settled, right foot tasting the ground, hips pointing toward the possible, shoulders bearing more than a uniform ever had. He looked down the lane and saw the track not as cinder and paint but as forgiveness laid in a straight line. In the stands, ordinary people held their breath for him the way strangers sometimes hold doors. He wondered at that kindness, that a city would offer its breath to a man it did not know. The starter raised his arm. There is a silence before the gun where the body negotiates with history. He could feel the weight of the letters in his pocket, feel the steady gaze of the shooter hours away cleaning the moment before impact, feel the city's patched heart beating beneath the seats. He thought of the orchard and the river and the candle. He thought of his shoes wrapped in newspaper, of his grandmother's hands, of the coach's voice most days stern and today almost tender. He thought of the small boy near the tunnel holding a cardboard sign that simply said, "Run please," in pencil. The gun cracked. He moved. Nothing dramatic at first, nothing like the movies. He slid into the shape of his stride like a man putting on a coat he thought he'd given away. The first steps were a negotiation with gravity. The next were a confession. He felt the track come up to meet him, felt his arms find the quiet swing that makes a body a metronome. The world narrowed to a ribbon of air just in front of his chest. He followed it the way a pilgrim follows a road. He remembered, suddenly and with such force it almost unmade him, the first time he had run as a boy, barefooted on a road near a field where the wheat bowed like a choir. He remembered the laughing cruelty of summer, the way it forgives and forgets in the same breath. He remembered the first time someone timed him, and he had learned that a life could be measured in something other than survival. He remembered believing that the world might allow him to be a simple thing. Fast. Halfway, he heard the stadium's voice rise and then fold itself into a focused hush, the sound a city makes when it decides to hope as one body. He felt his legs heat with clean pain, the kind you shake hands with instead of fighting. The man in the lane ahead staggered on a step and recovered. The man behind him began to breathe like a bellows falling apart. The tape did not get closer. He got bigger inside the space between him and the tape. He did not think about medals. He thought about a letter small as a breath. In the last 20 meters, he found the thing he had come to recover. Not speed, not victory, but permission. The permission to spend himself without fear that someone would take the receipt and use it against him. He lifted, not because the coach had taught him to, but because the world allowed it. He crossed in a rush of light and ropes and noise, and then it was over and the noise changed and he was only a man who had remembered how to move. He walked the infield with his hands on his knees and the taste of iron in his mouth. The coach appeared like a verdict and put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing. The shooter waved his cap from the stands and looked away. A stranger in a bright dress offered him water as if it were a ceremony. He took it and drank and felt it travel like morning through a house. Later, the paper would print his time in numbers that looked like fragments of a broken clock. Later, a child would run his finger along the digits and try to memorize them. Later, the city would argue in pubs about whether he had taken it out too hard or waited too long to kick. But in the moment that would remain his forever, he bent at the start of his warm down and finally took one of the folded letters from his pocket. He looked up at the sky that had learned to be gentle again and read it under his breath, each word like a footstep. He did not cry. He did not have to. The track had done it for him. He jogged his warm down through a tunnel of small applauses, a line of volunteers, a handful of teammates, a janitor leaning on a broom, a woman in a hat who looked like she had buried courage and kept a little for later. On his second lap, he saw the boy with the "Run Please" sign again. The boy looked at him the way a mirror looks at a window. He reached out and touched the sign lightly with 2 fingers as if to bless the pencil. The boy grinned in a way that made the stadium brighter. That night, he walked alone through streets that wore the dark like a good coat. The city was a constellation of modest lights and honest shadows. In a shop window, he saw his reflection and did not flinch. He bought a stamp with coins that had shared a pocket with fear and placed the letter in a red postbox still bandaged from the war. He stood there, hand on the cool metal, and let the moment pass through him like a train through a station. He had not won a medal. He had won the right to be measured by something other than what he had survived. As he walked back to the barracks, the wind carried a sound from the stadium, soft, like a crowd practicing sleep. He thought of the final, of the men who would line up beside him, each with their own folded letters, their own orchards and rivers and candles. He did not know if his legs would carry him to gold. He did know that in this city, patched and proud, a man could run for peace and not be laughed at. He slept. It was a clean sleep, free of instructions. In the morning, he woke to the sound of kettles and courage. The coach nodded once, the way a man nods to a friend he rescued and trusts again. The shooter handed him a coin and said, "For luck," as if luck were a thing you could fold and place under your tongue. He pinned his number on without shaking. He went to the track not as a soldier on leave, but as a runner on duty. The stadium had learned his name. He could feel it in the way the announcer set it down, careful and firm like a cup on a table that mattered. He lined up. He let the silence before the gun do its work. He felt the whole world lean in without malice. When the gun cracked this time, it sounded less like war and more like a starting pistol, which in this new life was all it had ever needed to be. He didn't win the final. That's the part the newspapers rarely print, but it's the truth. He finished 4th, close enough to see the medals glint, far enough that the cameras turned away. He bent over his knees when it was done, heart shaking, lungs wide as doors, and for the first time in years he smiled without rehearsal. The men who beat him shook his hand with the solemnity of survivors, not rivals. One of them whispered, "We all ran for someone today," and he understood that no one on that track had been running alone. In the stands, the boy with the cardboard sign jumped until his feet left the bleachers. The coach, who had spent the last decade telling men how to survive artillery, let a tear slide through the weathered lines of his face. The shooter clapped once, a single sharp sound that echoed like punctuation. The medal ceremony went on without him. He stood at the edge of the infield and watched the flags rise, each one stitched from a different kind of recovery. He didn't think of victory or loss. He thought of motion, of breath, of how strange it was that the human body could hold so much ache and still ask for more. Later, when the crowd had gone and the air smelled of rain and burnt dust, he walked to the starting line again. The stadium was empty except for a few volunteers sweeping confetti into tidy piles. He knelt and pressed his fingers to the cinder. The track was rough, uneven in places, patched like the city itself. He whispered something to it, not a prayer, but a thank you. And the wind seemed to answer by lifting the edge of a discarded program page and carrying it away like a small bird. In the barracks that night, laughter replaced silence. Men traded cigarettes for stories, medals for memories. They were all a little freer, a little lighter. The war had taught them to count losses. This day taught them how to measure grace. He packed his shoes carefully, the newspaper wrapping now soft and torn. He wrote one more letter, this time not to ghosts but to himself. It began simply, "You ran, and that was enough." He didn't need to post that one. He folded it, tucked it into his shoe, and left it there, a private relic for the miles still waiting. The train home rattled through fields newly green, past the same towns and signs, but the view had changed. Children waved at the carriages. Women hung laundry that snapped like small flags, and the air was full of hammering. The sound of people building instead of breaking. When he stepped off at his stop, no band played. No one knew they were welcoming back an Olympian. A dog barked, a woman scolded it gently, and the street smelled of bread. He walked to the house he hadn't seen since before the uniforms and the orders. The garden was smaller. The sky was the same. He left his bag by the door and sat on the steps. The world felt newly possible. He closed his eyes and listened. The quiet pulse of a city mending itself, the laughter of children running somewhere unseen, and deep beneath it all, the steady rhythm of feet on cinder. He smiled again. The race wasn't over, not for him, not for anyone. There would always be another track, another dawn, another chance to run toward peace instead of away from it. And that, he thought, was the only victory worth keeping. The years that followed didn't arrive in chapters, only in seasons. He built a life the way he had rebuilt his stride, step by step without measuring the distance. He took work as a postman because he liked the rhythm of walking, the steady repetition of routes, the feeling that the city spoke in addresses and doors. Some mornings he'd jog the first few streets before sorting letters, his body remembering the language of effort. People would wave at him from windows, and sometimes a boy would race him to the corner just to laugh at being young. His uniform was different now, blue wool, not khaki. His war medal stayed in a drawer. On his wall hung only one photograph, the finish line at Wembley, his body leaning forward in midair, caught forever between motion and stillness. The picture had been clipped from a newspaper and yellowed with time. The caption beneath had been trimmed off, leaving only the image. A man suspended in the exact moment he learned what freedom felt like. He didn't marry, though he was loved and loved in return. There were dances, walks by the river, letters that began with dearest and ended with yours if you still are. But he found peace in solitude. "I spent too long being ordered," he'd tell friends. "Now I just like hearing myself breathe." They understood. Everyone from that generation understood. The world was quieter now, and the quiet had earned its keep. Every 4 years, when the next games came, he'd sit by the radio or later the television and watch. He never compared times, never envied medals. He listened for the gun, and when it fired, he would close his eyes. Sometimes he could smell cinder and rain. Sometimes he could hear the faint rustle of flags. He always murmured the same thing: "Run well." In 1952, he received a letter with a foreign postmark and a small pin enclosed, a black enamel circle surrounding the 5 Olympic rings. The note was unsigned, typed on plain paper. It said only, "For those who remembered what the games were meant to be." He pinned it inside his coat where no one could see it. Decades passed like slow applause. The boy with the cardboard sign grew up to be a teacher, and once, on a gray afternoon, he brought his class to the museum, where an exhibit of post-war Olympics was being prepared. The teacher told them about a man who ran not for victory, but for forgiveness. The children looked at the old spikes displayed behind glass, their leather cracked, their laces frayed, and one of them asked, "Did he win?" The teacher smiled and said, "More than most." The man himself never saw the exhibit. He had already begun his quiet retirement in a small coastal town where gulls replaced crowds. He ran on the sand at dawn, slow and uneven but steady, leaving footprints that the tide always claimed back. Neighbors learned to wave when they saw him. Some knew his story, most didn't. It didn't matter. One morning, long after his hair had turned white, he found a letter in his postbag addressed in careful handwriting, "To the runner who ran for peace." Inside was a medal, not gold, not silver, just a small circle of pewter engraved with a single word: "Thanks." There was no return address. He placed it beside the old spikes on his shelf. When he died quietly in his sleep one April morning, the town's paper printed a small notice: "Local postman, former Olympian, passes away at 74. The article ended with a line from a neighbor: "He was a kind man, always moving, even when he didn't have to." At his funeral, the vicar read a psalm about running the race set before us. The coffin was carried out under a sky streaked with gulls, the sea wind sounding almost like applause. On the path from the church to the graveyard, children ran ahead, their shoes clattering on the stones. Years later, during another summer games, a documentary crew digging through archives found his story. They pieced it together from fragments: a race result, a letter, a photograph, a voice on an old interview tape saying, "You can't outrun your past, but you can choose what you run toward." The episode aired late one night. For a few minutes, the world remembered a man without medals who had crossed a finish line no stopwatch could measure. And somewhere, in the sound of the starter's gun echoing across another stadium, his story lived again. A quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest race is not about speed, or victory or glory, but about the simple, impossible grace of learning to move forward when the world finally allows you to stop running from yourself. When the cameras packed away and the stadium lights dimmed, London 1948 became more than a sporting event. It was the first sound of the world breathing again. The games of the 14th Olympiad, the Austerity Games they called them, were held not in opulence but in recovery. There were no new arenas, no lavish feasts, no flags raised on brand new poles. Every track, every lane, every rope and banner had been borrowed or patched. Yet in that borrowed world, something was reborn. Historians would later write that the London Games were a gesture, a handshake offered by nations that had nearly destroyed one another. But gestures have weight when made by those who remember loss. Every athlete who arrived on those shores carried a story like the one we've just heard, of battles fought, friends buried, families lost, and the fragile hope that sport might build a bridge where war had left a crater. The British runners trained on cinder tracks laid where anti-aircraft guns had once stood. The French came with uniforms sewn from fabric meant for ration cards. The Dutch cyclists brought their own food because their country was still learning how to feed itself again. The Japanese team was not invited. Their nation was still under occupation. Germany, too, remained silent in the stands. Its athletes watching the games through radio static, listening to a world they were not yet allowed to rejoin. Yet even without them, something remarkable happened. The lanes, the courts, the pools filled with motion instead of grief. The games didn't erase the scars of war, they illuminated them. Every scar became a starting line. There was a British weightlifter who had survived Dunkirk, his right leg twisted by shrapnel. Doctors told him he'd never compete again. In London, he lifted twice his own weight and bowed as if the applause itself were heavier than any barbell. There was a Polish fencer who had escaped a labor camp and trained in exile, using broomsticks as foils. He fenced with the grace of a man dueling his own memory, and there was a French nurse-turned-sprinter who had carried messages for the resistance in the soles of her shoes. She ran barefoot in the heats and finished smiling, because no one was chasing her this time. Stories like theirs did not make front-page headlines. They lived in the margins of the results tables, in the grainy black and white photographs that yellowed in drawers. But to those who were there, those quiet victories were louder than any anthem. The world's press expected records, rivalries, and spectacle. What they found instead was something rarer: humanity rehearsing itself. The BBC commentator that week said, "We are watching not athletes, but nations learning to walk again." He didn't know how right he was. The crowds came, not dressed in jewels but in ration-worn wool, carrying sandwiches wrapped in newspaper. They stood for hours to see men and women run, swim, lift, and leap, not because they expected miracles, but because the act itself was one. Each cheer that rolled through Wembley Stadium sounded like defiance against despair. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, granting brief intervals of sun as if the clouds understood. After the closing ceremony, when the Olympic flame was extinguished, the world did not return to normal. There was no normal to return to. But the idea that nations could meet again without uniforms or rifles, that idea had taken root. The runner whose story we followed was one among thousands who discovered that moving forward could be a form of healing. In the years that followed, historians would point to London 1948 as the birth of modern sport, not because of innovation, but because of intention. It was the games that reminded the world that competition need not mean conquest. They gave us the first televised broadcast, yes, but more importantly, they gave us a broadcast of reconciliation. Many of those athletes went home to rebuild in other ways, as teachers, engineers, farmers, and parents. Some disappeared into quiet lives. Others became legends. But each in their own way proved that the human body, like the human heart, could be rebuilt. Today few remember their names. The medals tarnished, the records long surpassed. Yet if you walk through the old corridors of Wembley, you can still hear them. The echo of spikes on cinder, the rhythm of endurance. The track is gone, paved over and replaced, but sometimes the air still carries the faint scent of rain on ash and the whisper of men and women who once decided to run, not from fear but toward peace. The flame that burned in London did not just pass to the next host city. It passed through a generation. It became the quiet light in every athlete who understands that the truest victory is not crossing first but crossing together. And so, when the world gathers every 4 years to light that fire again, it is more than a ceremony. It is a memory of a time when humanity, bruised but unbroken, stood on a patched-up track, heard the crack of a starting pistol, and chose, collectively, to move forward.